Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for our Ingram Microcloud Elevate webinar on pricing up Azure solutions. And this is really a continuation of the boot camps that we just finished running with Rob Crane around the major cities over the last kind of couple of weeks, talking around how we look at a typical SBS solution and how we might migrate that into various Azure solutions and Office 365 platforms. So I'm really glad that you guys could join us today and carry on this conversation that we're having around the evolution of the Microsoft Azure platform. My name's Craig Bobed. I work here within the Ingram Micro Cloud team here in Australia, and today we've also got Rob Crane joining us as well, who's going to take us through the same kind of solution scenario that we talked about in our technical boot camps and how we actually take those various components and work those into the into the Azure pricing calculator. So on today's agenda, I'm going to keep it really brief and hand it very soon over to Rob, who's going to take us through on that SBS to Azure solution with the Azure calculator. And then I'm going to chime in near the end and just take you through a quick tour on how we then provision the Azure solution and spin up those tenants on the Ingram Micro Cloud Marketplace. And then also have a quick talk around the different tools that we have for the Azure CSP program, as well as what else we have in terms of our education and training, to skill up around Azure and the CSP platform. And then just a little bit on how we can get involved around the new Azure Mentor program that Microsoft has launched, as well as some of the other initiatives that we have in terms of resources to help you make these initial moves into the Azure platform. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Rob. And Rob, if you just want to give us a and let me just hand you over. Great. So, Rob, take us away.
Okay, so the point that we need to start looking at all of this sort of information when it comes to pricing is the publicly available Azure pricing calculator. So you can find that at that URL listed there, or just do a search to Azure pricing calculator. Now, as you'll see, basically it's an interactive calculator. What you do is you select the items from the list that you want to add to your estimate, and then you fill in the figures once it has done that. So again, it allows you to go in and potentially look at one item at a time and get pricing for that, and then export it maybe to a spreadsheet to refine it, or you can bring it all together into one very large estimate if you want. So that is available. That's the way that you go and do the pricing, and that will give you basically a public pricing for the items here. So when we're thinking about a solution, what we need to do is we need to obviously work out what our on-premises equivalent is. So if we take SBS as the example, SBS, a great product, but is a bundling of many, many components. Okay, so some of the components we can see here are a Windows Server Active Directory, which means it's a domain controller. You potentially could also be using something like SharePoint via Company Web. You could be using Exchange for your emails, files, and folders. There could be an SQL database and maybe third-party applications all on that one physical box. Now, typically what we see is that is backed up to an on-premises USB device and connected via a router out to the cloud to allow email delivery or to allow things like remote access. Now, the best starting point when it comes to something like Azure is to look at the low-hanging fruit, right? So the low-hanging fruit here that we can first go after basically is the backup. So what we can do is we can target Azure File Backup to take the files, so just the files, across the internet to an Azure backup location. Now, again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to do this in stages. We're not trying to do everything at once or do it all overnight. So the way that the Azure File Backup works is you basically put an agent on the machine to backup. You then target the file and then you send those to a location in Azure. Now, obviously, we need to determine the cost of putting our files into an Azure backup container. So when we do that, basically what we do is we go out to the Azure pricing calculator and we put in the option to do backup. Now, when we put in the option to do backup, you'll notice that it gives us a number of different selections that we can make. So the first place that we want to make sure is correct is our region. So obviously, Azure has a number of data centers around the world located in places like Australia East and in the Southeast, which is in Melbourne, but also in Singapore, Hong Kong, and all over the place. So normally you want to make sure that your region is set to Australia East, which is in Sydney, or Australia Southeast, which is typically in Melbourne. The next one is the instances. Now think of an instance basically as a container for your backups. Now what we could do is we can, again, given the flexibility that Azure gives us, we could say, like, we want one single bucket of 1 terabyte in which we're going to back up all our information. But with Azure, we have the option to do something like, okay, what about if we created an instance for files and folders, or an instance for this server, or an instance for servers versus workstations? So there is a slight difference in cost depending on how many instances you have, but having a different instance, again, allows you more flexibility and is also a different encryption option when you set it up. So the first decision you need to make is one instance or multiple instances. But in this case, we're going to keep it simple and stick with one instance. The next decision is, how big is this instance going to be? How much data are we typically going to put into this? Now, don't forget, we're putting in backup data, which means that typically we put in the initial backup, and then everything beyond that is a delta. Okay, so we're not taking a full image every day. It's typically going to be a delta style backup. So again, you just need to have those options, and basically the more storage that you want to have in your backup container, the more the cost does increase. But the reality is, as you can see from this calculation, is that storage is relatively cheap, right? So again, to do backup, it's very, very cheap. Now, the last option we've got as an option here is to pick basically whether we want locally redundant storage or whether we want zone redundant storage or maybe geo-redundant storage, depending on the option that we have. Now, what that dictates is by default, if we have locally redundant storage, we get 3 copies of our data is maintained in the data center. If we have zone redundant, then we get backup from Sydney to Melbourne. And if we want geo-redundant, then we get the data backed up not only in Sydney and Melbourne, but then probably off to Singapore. Now, obviously what happens is the more redundancy you have, the more copies, the more storage effectively that is in use, and therefore there is an additional cost. So part of this is to make the decision as to what the differentiation here is, and really whether you need something like geo-redundant, which is, again, a premium option. But there's nothing stopping you asking the client and providing that as an option for them. In this case, we'll keep it simple. We'll just keep it local. And as you can see, that adds roughly $3 to our cost, giving us a total cost of $16.10 per month in Australian dollars for 100 gigs of backup data. So we can now use that to fill up our location there with files and folders. Now, the second step generally is, once we're doing files and folders in the on-prem environment, what we want to be able to do is to back up things like running SharePoint, running Exchange, maybe SQL, and Active Directory. Now, we do that using an Azure option called Azure Application Backup, and what that effectively allows us to now target is to target everything on the SBS box. So again, the way that it generally works is that it requires uses the Microsoft DPM software, Data Protection Manager, and that then is able to target resources across the network, running applications like SQL and Active Directory, and send them to an Azure backup location. But as you may appreciate, the Data Protection Manager software is fairly sophisticated, and at this stage really isn't supported on a small business server. So as you can see, what we've done here is we've added a temporary on-premises backup console. Now, this could be something that could be sold as a cheaper low-end server, or you could sell it as a hardware as a service option. So they just rent that for the time that this is happening. But basically, we put the DPM manager on the backup console. We're going to use that backup console potentially for some other things. We then take that software, configure it, point it at all the applications and data in SBS, so we can do the files and folders as well as our applications, and we send that off to Azure. Now, the great thing is that when we come to calculate Azure backup for applications, we get the Data Protection Manager software thrown in for free. So the Microsoft Data Protection Manager software comes as part of the pricing for our Azure backup. Once again, in this case, the only cost that we would incur if we went to application backup is basically the storage, which we've already calculated. So again, provided that our application backup and our data backup for our SBS box doesn't exceed the 100 gig item or bucket instance that we've created previously, there's no additional cost. So it is exactly the same cost here. So you can use $16.10 to do a files and folders backup, but if you want to get more sophisticated, you can move up to the application backup, which will give you, like I said, the ability to target running services, and there will be no addition in cost. That is included in the price of Azure backup. Now, if we want to take our protection of our environment a step further, and we, for example, have the SBS box maybe running on a hypervised environment, Azure, we can also use Azure to do our site recovery, right? So if you haven't played with the site recovery, it is a standard feature of Windows, so you can do site recovery between two Hyper-V machines. But what we can also do is if we put Azure in the mix, we get a lot more flexibility here. So we could do from a primary site to a recovery site, but we could also do from a primary site directly into Azure. So what that means is that the replication is happening into Azure, and if we get any issues, we can spin up replacement machines and the information directly in Azure. So in this case, what we're going to have a look at when we do our pricing is, again, we're going to select the site recovery option in our pricing calculator. So again, site recovery is different to backup. So we go in and add the site recovery option, target the region as Australia East, and you'll see that we get two options, whether we want to recover to a customer-owned location. So that's basically using Azure as the intermediary point between two separate sites, or in this case, the second option we want here is to recover directly to Azure. So that means the backup data is going into Azure. So we want one instance of that again. So the instance indicates how many buckets, containers we have, and you'll see that to protect the instance per month basically is $31.84. So again, there's not a big step up when we look at doing the application backup to doing site recovery. So it certainly means that you could do the application backup as well as the site recovery if you wish to. So basically, when it comes to backup, whether it be site recovery, application or files and folders, you're typically looking at just the cost of storage, and storage into Azure are very, very cheap, as we've outlined here. Now, what we want to do then, let me go down here. So what we've basically done here now is that we're going to look at moving our files and folders from our on-premises environment basically into Azure. Now, you need to also consider in this mix here that really the applications that you're going to be using, the services, include not only Azure. So we're going to be using Office 365 here, the Exchange Online, the SharePoint Online, to provide locations into which we can put our files. Now, we can combine the Azure and the Office 365 together in a single tenant. So when you get Office 365, you get a single Azure tenant as well, which you can add a subscription into, add in the backup costs, VMs, and expand it from there. But things like Exchange from on-prem make the most sense moving into Office 365, software as a service, platform as a service, rather than running up your own Exchange VM on-prem. So typically what we're going to do is we're going to look at moving our Exchange data, SharePoint data, files, some files and folders we have. But the other thing that we can also do here is we can look at setting up a Smb File Share in Azure. So Azure supports the ability to create what's called an SMB File Share, which is basically just storage that we can map a network drive directly to. So what that gives us, hopefully, if I can find the pricing here, so that allows us to move those items into our cloud. So we can move some of our data into Office 365 that makes sense, and maybe some of it makes sense moving it into Azure Storage. So in this case, I've gone to the pricing calculator. I've added the storage option. You'll see that I've once again targeted the region as Australia East, but this time I'm selecting file storage. Now we've got blob storage, we've got table storage, we've got queue storage, and we've also got file storage. So in this case, we're just going to do files and folders. Again, I've got a different pricing tier depending on what sort of latency and response. So I've got a basic and a premium generally, and again, that just determines that if it's basic, it's normally on a standard mechanical disk, or if it's premium or the advanced one, it's on SSDs. Again, we've got the option for redundancy. Do we want it locally redundant, zone redundant, but we've kept it simple. Again, as a comparison, we've taken the 100 gigs of storage that we were using for our backup, and we've then priced that at $11.21. That's our storage cost. Now, when we talk about storage in Azure, one of the components you need to be aware of is that Azure is basically all the services broken down into individual components. So SBS was good because it was a monolithic solution and solved many problems. But today, the trend is to break all these out and only pay for what you need. Now, part of that means is that we've got a location to store information, but doing so, there is a price for operating on that data. So you'll see here that basically the cost is about 2 cents a transaction. Okay, so a transaction unit is 10,000 transactions. So it's basically 2 cents for every transaction. So think of a transaction here as an open, a close, a viewing, that sort of thing. Now, what I've done is just to make it simple, I've estimated, again, we're looking at 3,000 transactions. Again, multiply that by the 10,000 figure. That's how many opens, closed that could transpire in a month. That sort of cost, which is a significant amount of traffic, is adding about $57 to our storage. So for about $68, we're getting 100 gigabytes of cloud-based storage that is able to be mapped to on any network drive, including the SBS box, and function just like more or less like a normal file share that we have on our on-prem SBS box. Now, we've been able to move data, we've saved data, people have been able to back up the data directly to Azure. We've also then been able to map a network drive with credentials built into it, but at the end of the day, as we move forward, we need to have the identities, the logins, the passwords, the usernames in our Microsoft Cloud. So we need to basically connect those to Azure AD. So remember, Azure AD is the identity management for Office 365 and also for Azure. So we build those together, and we need to typically use the Azure AD Connect software to synchronize our identities, copy the logins, the passwords, the identity information up to Azure to share between Office 365 and our Azure infrastructure. And because we've put in another server, we can put this sync software on there. So remember, that server could also be doing our application backup, but now we can also use it for synchronization using the Azure AD Connect. Now, the important thing here to remember is that Azure AD Connect is supported on a domain controller, except in the case where we're talking about small business server. So we have to have our synchronization software on a member server in our local environment to take identities from our SBS domain controller and basically synchronize to the cloud. Now, once we do that, we then have a copy of the users locally and a copy of the users in the cloud, so they can start consuming services like what's available from Office 365. So then probably the next step you need to look at is what we want to do is we want to make our on-prem network and our cloud network one joined network. Now, the way that we do that is we do that with a site-to-site VPN. So again, provided we've got a good router on-prem, we can use that to connect to our Azure environment. So What we can do then is, as you see, is that we get a site-to-site VPN. We've moved most of our data into either Azure File Shares, OneDrive for Business, SharePoint, and we've moved our emails off into Office 365. And now we have a single network where our SBS network and our Azure network are effectively able to see and talk to each other. We can move resources between. So the key here is, okay, what's the cost of doing a site-to-site VPN here? So again, we go to the calculator, we select the option for a VPN gateway, we select the option to have it homed in Australia East. Again, we have a number of different pricing tiers, standard, for example, the premium one, so you get obviously better functionality, throughput, but you also get more endpoints. So, for example, the premium tier allows you to connect more endpoints, more sites into this location. We also need to target the amount of hours that will be running in a month. The billing in Azure is done on a per minute basis. In this case, we're estimating to run for 744 hours, which is a total of a month. Now, that's going to cost us $180 for that. Now, in Azure, you are charged for data that is outbound from Azure. Okay, so the only exception to that is backup data, where that is included in the cost. But if we have normal SMB traffic, then we are obliged to pay for traffic that is leaving Azure. So again, what I've done here is I've estimated 100 gigs of outbound traffic. So we could think about that as 200 gigs in and out in total. We don't pay for half of that. And that cost then is, again, a relatively small amount of $16.70, giving us a total cost for our VPN to run 24/7 of about $200 a month. So that will give us a site-to-site VPN between Azure and our on-prem environment. So now what we've got is, well, if we've got the same network, we can now start targeting other resources on our SBS network. So remember that in our SBS environment, all our workloads are typically on the single box. So we've got one massive box trying to scale to run applications, SQL, Exchange, SharePoint, or whatnot. So what we can do with Azure here is we can now start breaking these off into individual components. So we could take the SQL and we could create a dedicated VM in the cloud. Remember, site-to-site VPN means that local clients could still see it, and then we can give it its own set of resources. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to pick the example of a virtual machine that is running Windows out of the Australian East. Again, I'm picking a D2 VM, so 2 cores, 7 gig of RAM, 100 gig standard. And if we run it for a full month, 24/7, it's going to cost us $278. Now, this is just the virtual machine. It includes the Windows OS license. There are additional virtual machines that include the Windows license and the SQL license. But in this case, what I've done is I've just stuck with a Windows machine and in some cases assumed that the SQL licensing you have on-prem with SBS could be transferred into an Azure virtual machine, but you've got the flexibility here. But I want to illustrate a point a little bit further down the track. So again, keep in mind here that 744 hours of this machine will cost us about $280. So not only do we have things like SQL Server, we can also have third-party apps. Now, third-party apps on our SBS server have typically been problematic because they've wanted full access, they've wanted dedicated resources, they've wanted more resources than SBS could provide. So again, we can take that component that was monolithically embedded into SBS, we could break it off, we could create a dedicated VM in Azure that just ran that third-party application. Now, the benefit to that is we can scale that. We can make sure that that VM is exactly the right capacity and size. If we need to upgrade it, we can easily do that by changing the machine type. There's no additional hardware. We can basically change from a D2 to a V2 machine to give it more resources. And the other benefit is we can lock down RDP access to that machine based on standard ACL permissions. So if that third-party product is being provided by someone else, you can basically get their IP address and lock RDP access to that server. They can have full access to it, full admin access to it to do what they need to do, and you're secure in the knowledge that it is locked down to a known IP address, but still on the network. And again, making it independent gives it the ability, obviously, to have different DR, to have be backed up, upgraded. So again, we're taking the SBS monolithic model and we're beginning to break these components out into Azure to work out how to get the most optimal result for these. Now, the example here is, again, I've got a D2 V2 machine to run our third-party app. But the difference here is, and this is one of the advantages that Azure does bring to the fold here, is the fact that we don't have to run it for the full amount 24/7. So in this case, I've selected 600 hours as a nominal example. So maybe we can set up an automated process that the third-party application is shut down over weekends. The machine automatically shuts itself down that you can set up. And obviously, by it not running, it's not consuming compute resources. Therefore, it's able to save the customer costs. So again, you may not be able to do this. People may need to remote in on weekends. We understand that. But part of the ability, the flexibility is you can now go to a client and say, you know what, that machine, rather than the $280 a month, if it's running 24/7, if it's not really going to be running that, if it's not going to be running in the middle of the night, or maybe on the weekend, or maybe not over Christmas, we can shut that down automatically and then restart it automatically, and that's going to translate directly to savings for the bottom line in your environment. So importantly, some of the things that we can now do in Azure, now that we've split these applications out into their own dedicated environment, is basically configure these and optimize these for actually when they do run, the type of machine, the type of memory, again, to get the best value for the customer. And importantly, we can also revisit that at any point in time and make quick and easy changes without having to go out and purchase additional hardware. Or conversely, if the customer wants to scale back this third-party virtual machine and have less power because they're not using it as much, then we can easily scale that down by changing the machine type and, again, saving money for the customer. So basically, we've been able now to move files and folders, Exchange to things like Office 365, but we've been able to, thanks to our site-to-site VPN, move the virtual machines, the SQL loads, and the third-party loads directly into the cloud. So typically, what we're left with is our Windows Server, our Active Directory on-prem. Now, what we can do here is we can move the Active Directory machine into its own dedicated domain controller in Azure. Now, obviously, part of it is really how much compute power does a domain controller really need. So you probably don't need a D2 V2, which is 7 gig of RAM and a really large disk. We now may be able to get away with an A1. It's just one core, and in this case, I've selected 1.75 gig. So you'll see that if we run that 24/7 for a month, it only costs us $100. So we can now match the workloads to the machines and get better value for the customer. So we've got effectively a huge range of machines that we can call on and task them for specific needs. So again, this gives us the ability to work on a domain controller, put on patches, update it, and reboot it without affecting the third-party app. So again, we're moving from that monolithic environment to the ability where we've got the maximum flexibility. That said, of course, if you wanted to pile everything onto a single virtual machine with lots of RAM and disks, yes, you could certainly do that if you want to. But we've now got the flexibility to be able to price this out by individual component. Now, when we look at it in Azure, what we can also do is once we start breaking these out into individual loads, we can then, again, look at the billings or the costing of these individual components. So let's say that you have multiple servers that are dedicated to functions of different departments within the organization. So with Azure now, with a dedicated machine per function, you can now go into your pricing, the reports that you get, and you can now say, well, we know that accounts is using this much compute, this much storage, this much virtual machine, whereas finance is only using this, and this. So again, it gives you that low-level ability really to drill down and match the resources. So now what we could do, as you see here, we've moved our domain controller into Azure using a much smaller virtual machine. Now the good thing here is that because it's now a standalone domain controller with a current version of Windows, we can move our synchronization from our on-premise console into our virtual machine in Azure, and that can now be doing our Azure AD Connect. So effectively now, when left with nothing on-prem, we could recover the console, again, cancel the monthly payments. We could, in theory, move the site-to-site VPN if you don't need the clients to connect. Typically, the site-to-site VPN could stay in place typically for older Windows 8, Windows 7 machines that need to do domain joins NTLM authentication. But again, if you're moving towards a Windows 10 environment, remember that they can do an Azure AD join directly. So when we get to the point that the possibility with Windows 10 current software, the reality here is that we're getting to a point where we can, I believe, move the majority of a typical SBS environment into Azure. And again, if that is the case, if that is a possibility, I think that the most logical step is to look at doing the hybrid, do the site-to-site VPN, and that gives you the best of both worlds. You can leave some of it on-prem, you can move some of it to the cloud, and then over time you can shift that, because thanks to the site-to-site VPN and Office 365, it's effectively all one network. But the trend obviously is to end up in an environment where our infrastructure is then moved into Azure, our applications are moved to services like Office 365, and then once it's moved to Azure, what we can also do is we get the flexibility to, again, eliminate things like the domain controller. So Azure now has domain services, Azure AD domain services, which is effectively a domain controller as a service, which means that we could potentially eliminate the virtual machine here in Azure and just use that as basically platform as a service, again, saving more money. So lots and lots of options. Another one here that we could point out is we could move the virtual machine that is running SQL into Azure SQL platform as a service. That eliminates the need to have a virtual machine. We just consume platform as a service. So if we drill down into our monthly cost, again, this is just, again, a very, very rough estimate of what we've got here. You'll see we've got our 100 gig of file and application backup, so we can back up our files and our applications. That's going to cost us about $16. 100 gig file share is, again, about $68. An SQL server, again, that we would license ourselves about $280. A third-party server that we are going to run for not the complete month, maybe 80% of our month is going to cost us $225. And if we do a domain controller, that will also run Azure AD Connect on a lower powered machine. We end up with $107. Don't forget that we also need to pay for the bandwidth that's coming out of Azure and the VPN, and that's going to cost us around $200. So in this example, we're looking at a cost, an estimated cost of around $892 a month. Now, again, we can look at this and we can say, you know what, if we put in a third-party application server, do we really need the 100 gig of file share? So we could probably save on that, because we could run our file share out of our third-party VM, or maybe we pump up our domain controller with the Azure AD Connect, and we don't need the file share. When we move our infrastructure into Azure and Office 365, again, do we need that 100 gig file and application backup, because we've been backed up and have redundancy in Office 365? We also can do snapshot style backups using the Azure portal from the virtual machine. So again, maybe we can save money there. Again, another indication here may be in the long term, the domain controller and Azure AD Connect can be removed, because we replace that with domain services. The final one here is in an environment where Windows 10 machine clients are connecting to this environment, we really probably don't need a VPN, because those can do a direct join to our environment and don't require the VPN. So in that case, again, we can eliminate that cost as well. So the reality here is that there are, like the way people do quotes today, resellers do quotes, they maybe go out and look at one supplier for the server, maybe look at a different supplier for the disks, look at another supplier for memory or networks or routers, all this environment. Now, the big thing here is all of that pricing now for infrastructure is under one roof. It's done through one pricing calculator provided by one vendor, so that's making it much, much easier, I believe, to do the calculation. Sure, it means there are more components to sit down and price out, but when you look at it, you'd be doing the same sort of thing on-prem. So again, I think the amount of time required and the calculations and the actual line items you have to add are going to be very similar to what's on-prem. Now, the other big plus in all of this is that when it comes to deploying infrastructure in something like Azure, the important thing is we can now deploy that infrastructure using software, using scripting, using templates. Okay, so if we have an SBS environment that is fairly standard, and we want to move a number of customers who are in a similar environment. Once we've done it once, we can take the scripts from that and then use that to recreate our environment again at much lower cost. So we don't really have to do a run-up anymore. We simply run a script to get the same result. So again, this is very, very different in that respect, and the opportunity to automate and to save cost is quite significant. Okay, Craig, I think that's all from me, and I'll be back over to you.
Fantastic, Rob. Thanks very much for that. And just to kind of reiterate on some of Rob's points there, what we come across here in the cloud team when we're working with resellers about pricing up these solutions is the first question what we'll ask is, what does the customer do and how do they do it? Because we really need to understand, what applications that they're using. If they are using SQL, can it go into SQL database as a service? Is something like Office 365 and the SharePoint side going to be a good place for their files, etc. And really understanding the workloads, because what Rob has kind of just gone through there is kind of almost like a worst case scenario as such. There's a lot of ways that we can spin the boat. And so for us to kind of help you price these solutions up, we really do need to understand the workloads that they're using, when they need to access these services. So the more information that you can give us, the better that we can get to a more tailored solution. And look, there's tools and services that we have that can enable you to do that, and I'll touch on that as well. Just one other, I guess, a tip around the calculator. As you're watching Rob go through there and look at, the different machines or the different VPNs, etc., you would have noticed a little blue circle with a little I in the middle of it. Anytime you click that, that will actually give you the option to also flick through to the resource page, take you through the different comparisons of the different servers or the different types of VPN connections, and help you understand how those are priced out as well. So as you're working through, if you're never quite sure about what server I should be using or what resource allocation is best fit, a good tip is to jump onto that little I, and that will take you through to those relative resources pages. So just kind of carrying on now from where Rob was taking you through in terms of pricing up those solutions. Obviously, the next step is once you got to the point where, look, this is a solution that we want to move forward with, is now the ability to go onto our Ingram Micro Cloud Marketplace and spin up the Azure tenancy under the CSP program. I just wanted to quickly run you through that process because there's a couple of key things that ties into how the billing works for it as well. So obviously the first step is to jump onto our marketplace, and if you log into your normal Ingram Micro TechLink account, you can pop yourself a little shortcut up the top there, or normally there's a big tile on the right-hand side to take you to the marketplace, which you'll be delivered with this front page, and you'll just need to log in, and that will auto-sign you in using your TechLink credentials. You'll need to navigate through to the infrastructure side of things, and you'll see Microsoft Azure up there, and that will take you to this page here. Now, basically, the thing to remember is with Microsoft Azure, because it is usage-based, there's no kind of upfront charge. Essentially, all we're going to be doing here is just creating the tenant. So you'll see that there's no cost price because we won't know what resources you've used until the end of the month. So the billing for Microsoft Azure is always a month in arrears. We get, obviously, the report from the Azure platform as to what resources have been consumed, and how long they've been consumed for, and that's really key as to what Rob was touching on, that, you don't have to be running everything 24/7. There are ways to auto-script things to turn off and down to really hone down those costs. As we go through, you either select a new user, set up a new user, or you might have an existing user. And here we've got Mr. Test Ingram Micro. We've already got their details in here, so all we're asking for is just the .onmicrosoft.com domain name. We're going to check that that's valid, and then obviously re-enter it again just to confirm it. But we're also going to grab your Microsoft Partner Network number. And just a little bit of a gotcha here, that MPN has to be a valid MPN with a valid Microsoft Online Service Provider Agreement, or a MOSPA, because part of the process when we go to spin up these Azure tenants, we will actually check the Microsoft database to ensure that that MPN number is a valid number. If it's not valid, then it will come back with an error. So we do need a valid MPN number in order to spin up a Microsoft service. So it's just key. If you've never gone on and used our platform before to spin up 365 or Azure, please just double check before you go to do your first one that your MPN number is valid, and you can check that on the Microsoft Partner Portal. So as soon as you click go, essentially we'll spin up the tenant and then we'll email you confirmation that the tenant has been spun up, and then for you to go in and log into the Azure tenancy itself, and you're going to reset the password, obviously the default one that we gave you. And that's going to verify everything and then actually spin that tenant up. Now once that tenant has been spun up, if you then log back into the marketplace and go to your customer control panel, you'll see now that you can select the Azure CSP service within there. And now within here, you'll see that Azure tab, and this is obviously tied to the specific client that you've spun the service up for. And a couple of key things here is, one, this is now a central place for you to sign into the Azure portal. So again, with the marketplace, across all the services, it's really key to understand that both from a provisioning piece, but as well as a management piece. You can always go into the actual vendor portal straight from your customer. You also note there that one of the other tabs is the usage report and the price list. So as soon as we get the report from Microsoft, we will update that usage report, and that will have down to the second on the resources that have been used and give you the applicable cost within there as well. So if you ever need a really full breakdown of the Azure usage report, this is where you'll find it on the customer control panel. But essentially, once you've spun that up and then connected the customer through the control panel, now you can just dive straight into the Azure portal and then start spinning up those services. So that whole process really takes about 5 minutes. As soon as we can verify your MPN number, we'll spin up the Azure tenant, we'll fire you that confirmation. You'll then just need to change that default password, log in through the control panel and dive into the portal, and you're ready now to start spinning up those resources. Now, one of the things I wanted to touch on, and I revert back to my comment before, is we really need to understand the environment that you're looking to move across, and not just from a machine level. You know, it's not really much use for us to understand the current bare metal box that they've got now that's got 32 gig of RAM and so much hard drive and so much, core processors, etc. We really need to understand the resource requirements of the environment that you're looking to move across. And so there's a couple of ways that we can do that. So obviously we also work with the guys from BitTitan, and as part of their BitTitan Azure Starter Kit, they have two kind of services. The initial one is their health check for Azure, and that will allow you to run series of agents across machines for normally a period of around about 14 days during like a standard good busy period, and that will come back with a whole range of information around network usage, resource usage, and give you a really good idea of dependencies of those different machines on there. And obviously, as part of the migration, you've also got their database migration tools within there, particularly around things like moving SQL databases across. Now, if you're looking for a little bit more something hands-on, maybe you're going through your first kind of couple of migrations, as part of our services department here in the cloud team, we also work with the guys from Net and Rich. And they have a good couple of, starter packs around Azure. The first being hands-on assessment services for Microsoft Azure, looking at their environment, but we're working with you hand in hand to really understand those resources. So whereas the Azure Health Check is a report that will come back based off the agents, Here it's a little bit more hands-on. The guys will really kind of help dive into how the customer is actually using their current environment. And then they've got a set up and managed services for the backup and disaster recovery. So that's your Azure Backup and your Azure Site Recovery services in there as well. And then a white-labeled, white-gloved migration services across into that, the infrastructure and applications piece. And I'll touch on these two a little bit more around what we're doing in terms of our Azure program as well. But the final thing that I wanted just to point out is on the same area on the Azure portal where they have the pricing calculator, they've just released this TCO calculator as well, giving you the ability just to jump in and put in the current compute of the environment that you're looking at, and that will give you, I guess, a high-level overview of what it looks to run that environment on-premise versus inside Azure. There are a bunch of different variables in there and some assumptions that they make, but well worth a look and starting to look at how you can try and present even just from a cost savings, let alone a technology benefits situation of one of the reasons to move into something like Azure as a technology platform. One of the other good tools, particularly if you are looking to use Azure and Office 365 as a platform going forward for your clients, is the Cloud Console that plugs into the ConnectWise platform with the ConnectWise team that we work with. So their Cloud Console will actually plug directly into both the Office 365 and into the Azure platforms and start pulling out that monitoring and health information, be able to help manage the services within there. But then if you're using ConnectWise from a billing and contract management piece, enable automation to actually kind of connect the services into your billing and your contract management piece as well. That's something that they're constantly working on as well, and just released a version for Azure on that also. Now, I just wanted to quickly dive into some of the educational side of things as well about what we're doing in terms of the Azure world. As I said, we have just finished doing our last round of technical boot camps for the year, working with Rob, on a hands-on migration process for SBS into Azure. We are starting to build that more and more of those types of lessons into our on-demand portal, and I'll hand these links out later. But we've got our Elevate on-demand portal. We also have a range of stuff on our YouTube channel, and we also have a range of email courses on there as well. Really easy way to skill up. And of course, there is obviously a big chunk of resources from the Microsoft guys as well. But the Microsoft Virtual Academy is a really good place to start. You'll see there the Azure Fundamentals. That's a really, really good place to start to get around from a technical perspective as well. Now, one of the final things I wanted just to touch on is some of the programs that we have in place with the Microsoft team as well. So Microsoft have just recently launched their Azure Mentor program. So if you are just getting to kickstart your kind of, I guess, go-to-market in the Azure space and you're looking to use this as a platform moving forward, the Azure Mentor program is a way where we can help you, one, accelerate your technical knowledge as well as from the go-to-market piece as well. The idea is to, one, obviously build up your knowledge, but also look at helping you attain those competencies on there as well. And again, develop a real go-to-market around those services that fit into your client base. Now, there are some boxes that you need to tick because it is very hands-on and it is around a 6-month kind of course, but they will give you a dedicated technical resource. You also start working with your local partner channel development manager from the Microsoft team, as well as your local Ingram Micro Cloud team representative as well. So if you are looking to jump onto this program, do reach out to our cloud team. We can have to talk to you a little bit more in depth around what the program takes, but we will need to go forward with you, have some 3 to 5 real opportunities with customers that we can actually work with. So we don't want it all just to be, pie in the sky. We need some real deals to get hands-on and really work towards what those solutions are and kind of take those out to market. But really, really good program. Again, it covers not just the technical side, but also around that go-to-market and pre-sale side, and you'll get dedicated resources from Microsoft to actually help you to be able to do this as well. So again, please do reach out in that regards. And the other side is, look, within our Ingram Micro team here, we do have technical resources on here as well as go-to-market resources. We do have a big Azure program in place at the moment. So if you are looking to move forward, one, into that Azure Mentor program, or maybe you have some projects, up and coming, ready to go in the next kind of, 3 to 4 months, etc., we can help you from a funding perspective around, getting you hands-on with whether it be the Azure Health Check from BitTitan, or getting the NetEnrich guys to help you work through some validity of, your first couple of Azure projects. Just need to reach out. Let's have a discussion around what you're looking to do, what you've got on board, and we can absolutely go through and move forward from there. All right. Well, I know it's been a big session this afternoon, so thank you very much for joining us. Contact details are on there. I know there have been quite a few questions come through today. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to run through them all, but please do take note of the email address here, imcloudau@ingrammicro.com. Please do reach out. Guys will be able to jump on the phone and give you a call back. But thank you once again for joining us. Thank you again, Rob. It's been great. Enjoy your afternoon. Thanks, everyone.